Hello and welcome to the Practice Discipleship Training Project. This is Dawn Troutman and I am your host throughout all of these webinars. This project is a result of a partnership between the ELCA Youth Gathering and the ELCA Youth Ministry Network. The goal is to provide quality training opportunities for adults who are bringing youth to the gathering and for adults doing any kind of ministry with young people. So the point is we want to equip adults to do excellent ministry with young people. This is a series of 7 webinars, and today is the 3rd. The design team was intentional in having the first 2 webinars really focus on theology, our foundation from which all our skills, strategies, and ideas flowed. And if you'd like to catch either of those, they are available on the network website, and we'll give you that address at the end. Today's webinar focuses on your role as leader. Our presenter is Dr. Terri Elton, professor at Luther Seminary. And before we hand it over to Terri, I want you to know this is an interactive live webinar. We are all on the line unless you are listening to the playback later, and we really do welcome your questions. It won't work without your involvement. So if you see this box on the right side of your screen, there's a place to type in your questions. We'll get to as many questions, comments, and feedback as we possibly can. So please do acquaint yourself with that. Get ready to type in questions as we go along, and we will be interacting with Terri. So let's welcome Terri. Hi, Terri.
Hi, Dawn. Thanks. It's great to be here today.
Well, thank you for being here. As you know, I've known you a long time, Terri, but if you could tell us all maybe 3 major things about you beyond this lovely picture on the screen.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to. First of all, I'm married and have 2 adolescent kids, one actually in high school and one in a freshman at college. So I live in the midst of this youth ministry stuff every day. In addition, I served in youth ministry in children, youth, and family in some way for 16 years in a congregation before I went on to teaching. So I can't get too far from that experience. And third, I just really enjoyed being a part of this 3-person team with Jeremy Myers and Tiger McLuhan in putting these together. And I'm very excited for what the whole team is doing around this with the ELCA gathering.
Thank you. Well, let's jump in. I know you have a lot of content, so let's jump in and get going.
Yeah, that would be great. Today, our workshop is about you as your role as a leader. And we titled it, It's Not About You, It's About You. I know that's kind of confusing, but we're going to get after that as we get going today. But the real heart of it is that leadership is about joining God's work in process. So we're excited to have you be a part of this leadership training. But before we get too far into this, I want to start with an activity. And so if everybody either could get a little piece of paper, or if you can at this time on a Sunday, remember, think about a time when you experienced either great leadership or poor leadership. All right, get that idea in your head. And then I want you to think of 5 to 6 key characteristics that either made it positive or negative. So I'm going to talk a little bit as you think about that and write it down. I think of some times when I've had great leadership, and one of the things for me that's been really important is that not only were they good with ideas and kind of articulating those ideas and good at executing those ideas, but they were also good with the people part. They remembered people's names, or they would stop and listen to what people had to say. So those might be 3 things, for example, that I'd write down about great leadership. So are you good? Do you have that? Now put that aside for a minute, and we're going to pull that up later. Today we're going to talk about leadership in ministry, which is a particularly unique setting. And while there are many frames that we could use to talk about leadership, we're going to use one particular angle today, and that's the idea of leadership as servant leadership. For this session, we're going to see servant leadership around 3 big ideas, and you see those on your screen. Ministry is first and foremost about God and God's work in the world, and we don't want to lose that first idea. But second, we as Christians are empowered by the Spirit to join God and God's work in the world. And then third, we're going to talk today about servant leadership has some particular skills that come with it, so we don't want to forget those in the midst. So those are the three big ideas that we're going to talk about as we think about leadership and ministry. But before we do, let's pause for a moment and say a word of prayer as we begin. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for our calling to be leaders in your church. We're mindful of those of us gathered, of the varied and diverse group of people that we are. We're also mindful of the varied and diverse contexts and groups of young people that you've called us to serve. We ask you not only to bless our time together this evening, but to bless us in this role that you've called us to. All this we pray in your name. Amen. So are you ready? Let's go. Let's begin. First part we're going to talk about today is that this work is about God. Leadership is not about us, just as it is about us. So as we think about this, your role as a leader, this saying that I've heard Tiger McLuhan say so many times is really descriptive for us. The first element that we want to highlight of your role as a leader is that it's not about you. It's about God. Leadership in a ministry context is different than other leadership roles because it's about what God's up to and how God works through ordinary people and ordinary situations to do extraordinary things. Now, if we think for a moment about some of the impact that leaders in the Bible have made, think of Moses or Abraham or David or Peter, any of those from the Old or New Testament. It wasn't their abilities or their faithfulness or their intellect that made them successful and impactful leaders. But it was about what God did through them. Servant leadership is different than other leadership models that our world lifts up. One of the core differences is that servant leaders seek to serve the master or the mission of their one that they're serving. So in the case of servant leadership in ministry, leaders serve God and God's mission in the world. So God's deepest desire is to be in relationship with all of creation so that all of creation may live abundantly. So God's work is to foster this abundant life. And how? By tending these relationships. God with God's people and God's people with one another. So for us as leaders, we get to participate in both of that. We get to attend to our relationship with God, just as we're also attending to help other people with their relationship with God. And keeping these two in balance can be hard. But this is when it's good to remember that this work is God's work, not just up to us. So let's go back to that idea about leaders in the Bible. Now, I named a few. Now, I want you to choose a leader in the Bible, and I want you to think about their relationship with God. So, I named some. Think about which ones you named. And in fact, if you want, you can type those in, and in just a few minutes, we'll name some of those that you are naming in your groups. Now, if you've thought about that leader, and you reflect on their relationship, how would you characterize their relationship with God? Was it smooth sailing or was it rocky? And in the midst of their leading, how was it that they attended to their relationship with God? What happened when they lost their focus? And what practices maybe were important to them? And how did these practices help them as they tended to their relationship? Now again, not only if you want to put the leader that you named, but if there's some of these ideas that you want to say about them, that would help us. And we'll, as those responses come in, we'll share some of those.
Thanks, Terri. There's already people responding, and this actually has more to do with the previous question, if I can jump back. Ellen was saying when we're looking at the characteristics of leaders, poor leadership is micromanaging, offering no vision, criticizing others' leadership efforts. So thank you, Ellen, for jumping in and being first.
Now, as you're finishing writing those things up, I want you to keep track of those and just kind of leave them to the side as we leave this first area, as we remember that this is about God. And we're reminded that leaders in the Bible didn't have it all together either. But there's some things that we can learn from these leaders as we think about our own leadership and what we're going to do to foster our relationship with God. Now I want to make the transition to our second area. And yes, as it's about God, it's also about discipleship. In John 21:15 through 19, we see the disciples of Jesus are there as Jesus has just died and rose, and they have this story, this time that they encounter Jesus after that. And just in a minute, we're going to read through that, and I want you, as we're reading through this, to make a list of leadership ideas that you see that come out of this text. Now I'm going to invite Dawn to read that for us, and as she does, again, on a piece of paper, write down some ideas, and as you're able or willing, send those in, and we're going to hear what other people have to say. Dawn, will you take it?
I will. And just before I read it, I do want to jump in and say that Kayla brought up Paul as a good leader because in the midst of leading, he made sure to take care of his relationships with God by praying daily and asking God to guide him as he led others. So thank you, Kayla, and everyone else. Keep your ideas coming in about leaders and also the leadership qualities you see here in John. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." And if I can jump in also, Patricia brought up Peter as a leader that she relates to. He wanted to just push ahead to serve Jesus, but always fell short. His relationship with God was buoyed most by Jesus and Peter's eventual total reliance on God. Thank you, Patricia. We'll go back to you, Terri.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. And it's really fun to hear not only the leaders that you named, but the impact that they have had and why you chose them. So thanks for sharing those with us. As we look to this text in John in particular, we think that the context of this time was after Jesus died and rose, and when Jesus appears for them. And so this is one of the last times that Jesus is going to be with his disciples. And I'm amazed at wondering, what is he trying to communicate here? There's a lot of relational conversation here going on. Don, do we have any responses yet from people?
Yeah, Dana saw in this passage that to take care of needs. So that's what we have so far. Thank you, Dana.
That's great. Thank you. Well, there's a lot of things that we could say about this text, especially about discipleship and our role as a leader. But let me lift up two for our conversations today. First, Jesus is speaking primarily to Peter. And yes, the other disciples are there in the story, but this is primarily spoken to Peter. And if we remember, right before Jesus died, the last time that Jesus and Peter saw each other, Jesus predicted that Peter would betray him. And in fact, 3 times the night he was arrested. And even though Peter said he wouldn't, in fact, he did betray him 3 times. And so this encounter is the first time that they see each other. And Jesus knows that Peter betrayed him, and yet that's not what he's worried about. In fact, he knows his sin, and rather than confront him, he asks him this relational question: do you love me? It seems like as we think about our role as leaders, this question is pretty core about us as we think about how we should operate as leaders. It's not just Peter that's asked that question, but Jesus also asks us that question as leaders today. Leader, do you love me? Then I want to bring up a second point from this text. As Peter responds, Jesus gives him his, quote, orders or work assignment. And that assignment, he says, feed my lambs. But what do you think that means? I think it means tend to my people, tend to my world, share the love that that we have for one another with those around you. So, not only are we invited to love Jesus, but we are also invited to join God's work and God's relational work of loving those around us. So, our second part of what it is to be a leader is to remember that it's about discipleship, about loving God and sharing that love with one another.
Thank
now,
you. I can jump in with my,
great.
I'm sorry. I know I can't raise my hand for you, Terri. I'm sorry. Ivy was also looking at verse 15, and she said when they had finished eating, Jesus was being a leader, simply participating in the community, helping form the community in the event of a meal. And she commented on the meal itself is a big part of group building.
That's great. That's a great example of, as we think about relational ministry and discipleship, what kind of posture? Does that mean over and above, or that we give orders? No, it's perfect example of we join in. And how much discipleship happens around a meal. That's a great insight, so thank you for that comment. Now as we transition, I want you to think about that list that you came at the beginning about great leaders and poor leaders. And I want you to think about what of those elements are particularly important for people in ministry, for leaders in ministry. And maybe circle or highlight ones on that list that are there, or add things that you think are important, specifically as we think about ministry leadership and what needs to be attended to. And again, if you want to text some of those in or put those in for us, we'd like to highlight those for the group.
One of the things that came to mind for me, Terri, with a leader I recently worked with, is he was so good at quickly finding something unique about each person and then really highlighting that thing to the group when it was a natural thing. So, you know, you're good at this, we're going to have you in charge of this. And everyone's talents were really lifted up. I was impressed. Dana said listening is what is most important for ministry leaders. Absolutely. Thank you, Dana.
Well, and I appreciate that, because I think sometimes when we think of leaders, especially outside of ministry, we maybe don't have listening on the top of the list. Now, there may be some that are maybe people that we work closely with or whatever, that we acknowledge that. But I think of when we name great leaders in business or whatever, those aren't always the quality. But certainly as we think about ministry, and certainly as we think about our role as leaders in discipling young people, I think what a great aspect to highlight is the ability to listen to young people. And add that to, Dawn, what you said, to particularly notice their gifts and to highlight those and to speak those to the group. What a way to uplift young people.
Absolutely. Dana agrees with you, and she added, it's important to practice active listening so that you're really hearing what people are saying, which dovetails very nicely with what you just said.
You bet. That's
all right. So please do text in more as you think of them, but we'll go on for now, Terri, and if as we get more answers, I will relay them to you. Thomas actually has just written in that a good leader develops lay leaders. So thank you, Thomas. Really creating more leaders in addition to yourself. And I'm going to pause for just a moment.
There we go.
Oh,
are we back?
Yes, I was just about to say we're going to pause and figure out what happened with Terry's computer. So here you are. All is well.
All right. I don't know where we got lost, but we're just moving to the third part. How is that?
Perfect. Let's do that.
All right. So the third part of being a servant leader is that leaders are active, and there's some particular things that they're active doing. So as we look back to John's text and we look at feeding my lambs, let's look at particularly what that might entail as we think of servant leadership. So let me highlight 3 kinds of gifts or skills that are huge clusters. So give me a little bit of a break for putting a lot of things into these buckets. But as I think about the things that leaders do to feed God's lambs, these are the big 3 that I think of. And as I name, for example, this first one, the administrative gifts and practices, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. And if there's some things that come to mind that are gifts or skills that you have in this area, write those down as we go, because we're going to pick those up in just a minute. Administrative gifts and practices include things like planning and organizing. Ministry has a lot of details that need to be attended to, and whether that's a big group or a small group, there are always planning and organizing that need to take place. There's also implementing, taking ideas and making them happen. That could be on a big level like strategy, or that can be on a little level like charting out to-do lists and assigning them to people and sharing the work together. Also, that this discipleship that we talk about can happen. There's tending to the logistics. Some of us are bent totally towards relationships, and the logistics can get in the way. Other people are great with the logistics, and once they get those set, it allows for those relationships to have the freedom to be in a safe environment, and for people to not notice if the temperature is too cold, or if the sound goes out, or if the microphone's not working, or whatever. So there's a bunch of logistics that some people are just wired and gifted to see to and take care of. I said this earlier, but creating a safe environment. One of the things that we know is that, especially with children and young people, how important it is to make sure that it's in a safe environment, not only physically, especially with younger children, but also way that they can share and talk about the things that are on their hearts and the things that they're about. So the first big cluster is administrative gifts and practices. The second big cluster I'm putting around communication and interpersonal gifts. Many of you have been in ministry settings that some people can just watch what's going on and have the ability to be adaptive and adjust the group to what's going on. Maybe it's the ability to watch a kid kind of getting out of control and the ability to kind of draw them in and shepherd the group to go in a different direction. Or maybe it's because the environment around the group has changed and they have the ability to adapt with that. So ability to read a situation is one set of gifts. Interpersonal skills, those could be in like pastoral care, the ability to really be a great listener and hearing people's problems and responding back to what they've heard and helping people work through those problems. It could be in helping facilitate friends having conversation or relating kind of to one another that way. Some of us are gifted in leading groups. They could be small groups, they could be large groups, but the ability to get people's attention and to have a conversation go someplace or to teach and learn on a big idea that really is engaging for the whole group. Recently, one of our people that does our large group worship came and spoke to our high school kids. And the ability for him to communicate to a group of people for about 10 to 15 minutes these days with high school kids was pretty amazing to me. And it was through humor, and it was through telling stories, and it was giving some facts or ideas. It was through using a video clip, but just gifted in leading large group. And that moves us into the last one, is just the ability to communicate. That could be verbally, that could be via written pieces. Some people have a great way of using communication tools there. It could be to youth, it could be to their parents, it could be to letting people know about an event more in the publicity or marketing area. But abilities to think about how are we going to know what's going on within that. So have you thought about, do you have any gifts or passions or skills in these areas? I bet you do. Now we're going to go to the third bucket, and these are more directly to ministry gifts and practices themselves. These are about things that are really about the practices of faith. Many that we've already talked about, but things specifically like leading the Bible study. Maybe some of you are really good at facilitating conversation, but maybe others of you are just really good about breaking open a story in the Bible that makes it interesting and draws young people in. Maybe it's worship, maybe it's prayer, maybe it's taking those together and really having people having alone time with God, or getting in touch with worship in some unique ways that people hadn't thought about before. Service is another great example. Today, for example, I was helping out with a citywide project where they were organizing, gathering food and clothes from around the whole community and then giving it directly to people in need. So they gathered it in a high school, and then they were turning it around in this evening. People are coming to get it. I think the gifts and passions around service were just huge today. Some of you are really good in what Dawn talked about, in helping people discover their own giftedness. Maybe it's informally by just noticing things, or maybe you have a strategy or tools that you use to help people, whether it's children or youth or other adults, figure out what are their gifts and what are their passions and how can they put them to use in ministry. And then finally, the thing that I want to highlight is all of this ministry as a participant can be great, but one of the particular gifts that is helpful is to reflect on practices. The ability now, for example, for this team of service people to come and to sit down with the young people that we're serving and to the help of the people that we're organizing and the people that we're donating, to say, what was it like to participate in that? How was God at work in that? Did that change your discipleship at all, your journey with God? So we've got a whole list in these three buckets.
I love it, Terri. Can I tell you what people are saying?
Love it.
So Lori kind of added to this slide before she even saw it, so yay Lori. Some leadership qualities are communicator / mentor / encourager. Another good leadership quality is to embrace interdependence. I love that. Remain open, integrity, and values diversity. So that's what Lori added to this list. And then Penny had a great question for you, Terri.
Yeah.
So what if I look at a list like this and it makes me feel inadequate? It's such a long list.
That is a great, we should give her a quarter or something. She tees up exactly where I want to go. Each of these sections, if you look at the next webinars coming up, we've highlighted some of them clustered around these. In addition, we also have some tools of where you can take this. So first, let me start with, if you think you might be gifted in administrative gifts and practices and want to go deeper, or if you're not, but you want to learn more about it to maybe wonder what would be a part of that. Two of our webinars coming up are around strategic planning and planning for the unexpected. Those are going to take a lot of the area of administrative kind of things and look at them more deeply. Some of us kind of think, I'm not an administrator, so I don't have any. So this will help you look at little pieces within that.
I love it, and Penny says, I'll be there.
Perfect.
She'll be there.
A second group, the communication and interpersonal gifts, we have some webinars coming up about specifically small groups and having one-on-one faith conversations. Well, clearly there are all kinds of things that fall into this category. As we think about kind of what are the two big things around leading with young people, the group of us said small groups by far and having one-on-one conversations. So there's 2 webinars around those clusters of gifts as well.
Perfect, thank you.
The other thing that, let me add one more thing. Sorry, Dawn.
Please.
We also have created a mini little tool that we will make available to everyone on this webinar and following webinars. That's just a 2-page sheet thing around 4 or 5 big areas underneath that with some sub-questions for you to say, maybe I have this or maybe I don't. If you're just still wanting a little more particularity just out of this webinar, we're going to have that tool available for you as well.
Wonderful. And Kayla says in response to what you're talking about, some of this is outside of her comfort zone, but she's able to balance it because she has support, advice, and encouragement. So she's not sheltered and she's not left to fend entirely for herself. Thank you for pointing that out, Kayla. You need a team.
Kayla, that is a great, great point. And one of the things I learned early on in my role of figuring out my own giftedness was that sometimes I had really some raw talent, if you will, in certain areas, but I needed mentors or people or a team to come alongside me. And even in the areas where I was gifted, I needed some coaching and mentoring. And sometimes I needed people to come alongside and tell me, you know what, I can see you're struggling, and can I help you and even take that off your plate? And as an early leader for me in ministry, that was awesome. And so one of the things I encourage you to do is if you just are struggling in an area, ask for help. And maybe A, it could be a coaching situation, or B, it might be something to say, you know what, I as a leader have to make sure this gets done, but one of the best things I could do is find somebody that loves it. And they will just run with it, and it will help us all work better as a team. So great idea, Kayla. Any other questions? Are we ready to move on, Dawn?
I think we're ready to move on, but just a reminder, if you tuned in partway through, there is a box on the right side of your screen, and whenever you have a question or a comment, please type it in there, and we will talk about it. Thank you. So for now, let's go on, Terri.
Well, as we are kind of turning the corner and getting to reflect on this, I want you to think about what are some of gifts you might have in this area, and to think about your own gifts and maybe ones that you kind of want to make sure that they stay strong and ones you want to grow in or tend to. So as you think administratively or interpersonally or within ministry, what are your strongest areas of leadership? I'll know, for example, for me, when I would be in front teaching, I worked with confirmation early on, and I was nervous about having to teach in front of a larger group of kids. But as I got doing it, I thought, I really got energized. And so pick an area that might be strong for you, and I'd love for you to commit to say, I don't want to let that strong area of leadership go. I'm going to keep working to keep that area strong, and maybe even grow it or look for opportunities to use it in a different way. And second, as we said, some of these might be kind of seeds that are ready to bloom. And so what's an area in one of these that you want to grow in? I have administrative gifts, but I also have big people gifts. And my people gifts always kind of get my first attention. But when I think back, there were some administrative things that I'm like, I would really love to learn better how to do that and grow in that. And so I would choose to do that and find someone, as I said before, to help me with that. But that was an intentional decision to grow in a particular area. And I'll tell you, it's been really fun to be able to see how that has really grown in my life over these years. And lastly, I want you to think about back to the very beginning where Jesus and Peter were talking, and he said, do you love me? Then feed my lambs. And that's a relational question. And so I want to call us all back to, as you're thinking about your own leadership, not only do you want to stay strong in some areas, not only do you want to grow, but also how are you going to keep connected with God? And maybe that could be as simple as every time before I go into a leadership thing, I'm going to pause and say a prayer and be reminded that this is God's work, not mine, that it's first and foremost God's mission that I get to join into. Let's see if anybody's willing to share something from their area, Dawn.
Yes, please do type in. And while you're doing that, there's a question from Dave, if you could dig into this.
You bet.
It's kind of a leadership in practice question. What if one of my volunteers really loves to volunteer in an area they are clearly not gifted in? How do I coach them, or when do we cut our losses?
Oh, that is an excellent question, and so lovely when it happens, isn't it?
Yes.
I think one of our roles as a leader is to come alongside people and to go back to what we said before, to start by listening. And maybe listening, why is it that they feel called to serve in this area, and why is it that they want to serve in this particular way? Maybe there's a clue, maybe, hopefully, in that might help us say, you know what, I get that you love to serve or volunteer in an area where your young person is, but you know what, I really see you've got these kind of gifts and we could use you there. Might be one way to lift that up. If that doesn't work, which it doesn't always work, I think there are actually times when with long periods of listening and reflecting back with people and working with them, we actually may need to redirect them. And for me, the reason is that sometimes people get in the way of ministry happening with young people in a really healthy and fruitful way. And part of my role as a leader is sometimes to have to tell people hard news, or that their ministry is their leadership is inappropriate, or their posture is inappropriate for the health and well-being of the group. So there are I think the places I'd start, but it doesn't always get to end in a pretty way. Sometimes we have to be the voice of some hard news.
It takes courage, is what I'm hearing from you.
It sure does.
Yeah. So Dana answered some of these questions. Thank
Great.
you, Dana. My strongest areas of leadership are building relationships. I want to grow in creative planning and not rely on what others have done. And she also said she'll keep connected with God through prayer before, after, and during my interaction. I love that, Dana.
That's great. Thank you. Very helpful.
If anyone else wants to write in, we are open to it, and otherwise we can move on a bit, and I'll let you know what other responses we get.
I think I love Dana's comment about the creative planning and that she wants to grow. I think we live in a time when leadership is more like jazz than it is, our learning our piano books and we do exactly what's in the book. Mm-hmm. It's learning kind of some basic things and then dancing with the group as we go. I think of anybody that will be leading a group to the gathering. I don't know any time I've taken young people on a trip that I haven't had to do jazz. You do the administrative planning, you set people up to be in interpersonal and ministry kinds of settings, but then there's always the times when you have to adjust and you have to adapt. And I think that's where it's also important to invite God in, not only personally to our relationship, but into the midst of what we're doing. And in fact, we're going to tee up some of how to do that in one of the webinars called Planning for the Unexpected. So I give you a little preview of what we got coming.
Good. Well, thank you. Let's move on for now.
I'm going to move us to some closing, and then we're going to open up for any general questions. So if you know that you have some questions about leadership that we haven't covered here, feel free to type those in, and we'll respond to them as they come in.
Thank you.
So servant leadership, it's important to remember that it's not about you, while at the same time it is about you. Your role as a servant leader is first and foremost to help God's people join in the work God's already up to in the world. More than once, I've been comforted by knowing that God has already been here ahead of me, especially as I think about doing youth ministry in a congregation and knowing that fruitful and faithful youth ministry has happened before me and I hope will be after me. But our role as a ministry leader is about tending our own discipleship journey as well as helping other young people do the same. And yes, as we noted, there are some gifts and skills and practices that help us do that. But what's at the heart of being a servant leader is that we love God and that we seek to feed God's lambs along the way. So there you have it, a nutshell of servant leadership.
Thank you. And Dave is wondering, as a servant leader, a faithful Christian leader, what are your go-to books?
Oh, that's a great question. I think of a couple different pieces for me. I think of there's an excellent book called The Leader's Journey, which I'm actually using it in a leadership class for children, youth, and family right now. And there's one element of it that talks about how we lead people in a congregation through change. One of the premises that we have is any type of leadership is helping people deal with some kind of change, whether that's learning something new or changing habits or whatever. But the other side of that is it also addresses our own personal journey of how do we deal with change? What are things that are going on in our life? So it's a nice way to help us think about our own journey as we're also leading at the same time. And their premise is that if we're not tending to our own journey and how we do those kind of things, we can't with the other. So there's great questions. It's a very interactive book. It's a very easy book to read. Again, it's called The Leader's Journey. So that would be one great one I'd recommend.
Great. Do you happen to know who it's by?
It's published by Josie Bass, and it's part of the Leadership Network series. So if you look it up there, I know it's got 3 authors.
Great.
So I forget them.
In addition to that, Thomas was wondering kind of a go-to book specifically about youth ministry as he prepares for the youth gathering.
Around leadership, and that there's one book called The 4 Views of Youth Ministry, and it looks at 4 different types of leadership models within that. That's one that, again, that I lift up. So that would be a second piece that I look at. And again, that's a collaboration of authors. They took 4 big youth names. Chap Clark, for example, is one of them. You may have heard of Chap, that are each kind of looking at a different way of thinking about ministry, and they lay it out and then they put it in converse, others respond to it. So it's a very fun, interactive book that way as well.
Wonderful.
So go ahead.
I'm sorry. Also, if I could plug, Kenda Casey Dean wrote Almost Christian, and I bring that up because that book really informed a lot of the gathering planning. So I found that book amazingly helpful. I read it chapter by chapter with a group of youth workers. We read a chapter and then talked about it each week. So interesting and really more of an academic thing, not a practical book, but very, very helpful. So Almost Christian, Kenda Casey Dean.
And that one is really good when it talks about the changes that we're experiencing in our culture. So that's a huge, that's a good recommendation for that. One of the pieces that, a different type of book, and this may be, I'm trying to read the question, what's underneath the question. Did I lose? No. Okay. It's called Youth Ministry Management Tools. It's a Zondervan book, and that is a great piece on really practical things for people, and especially as we looked at the administrative area of the gifts that we talked about, and some of us that aren't as gifted in that, but like to have conversation partners. That is a great tool book that has detailing kind of forms and things like, if you want, back to the volunteer leaders, if you want them to kind of fill out a little almost like application, it's not really an application, but kind of a sheet about what they're interested in and stuff like that, so you can help think about how to plug them in to leadership in a ministry, or just as a conversation tool. They have things like that. They have how to plan a retreat. I mean, they have all kinds of little ideas around that. And they have a CD in there so you can use the forms and download them and things like that. So again, youth ministry management tools.
Youth ministry management tools. And just somebody asked what we had just been talking about. That was Almost Christian, Kenda Tracy Dean, and the last name is D-E-A-N, and you can get that on Amazon or anywhere. Kayla had, it's not about books, but about leadership. Her favorite analogy for youth ministry is the road to Emmaus.
Yes.
That leaders often view themselves as the Jesus figure coming to meet with the people on the road with all the answers, but instead Kayla was once told to think about herself as on the road with the youth, and Jesus meets us both so as we grow in our faith together. Thank you, Kayla. Do you have any response to that, Terri?
Yeah, that's a great, I appreciate that, Kayla, that image. And a lot of people are talking about that with the word accompaniment and looking at ministry as accompaniment, whether that be with leaders with young people or whether that be ministry with those in the culture or those in service or those that are different than us as accompaniment. And as we walk together, we're moving, but we're journeying together and learning from and with, and yes, and that we're not the leader, but Christ is. So that's a great image for us all.
And I find it comforting because you don't have to know all the answers. You're journeying together.
Well, and one of the things about journeying is sometimes questions are more powerful than answers. And I think as we think of our role as leader, and especially using an accompaniment model or even an inquiry kind of discipleship model, sometimes asking thoughtful, reflective questions can be more impactful in the long term. I especially think of with older adolescents than trying to have all the answers, and what a great thing that is to not have to feel like you have all the answers.
Wonderful. So Craig is wondering how an experience like the gathering can be an opportunity to teach leadership to young people.
Oh, that's a great idea. Love it. One of the things that I've so appreciated in the last few gatherings that I've been at is both on the front end and on the coming home end, how young people get ideas like, for example, justice ideas or things that they really get jazzed about, and they want to do something about it. And high school kids, I think, are at a great place. In fact, one of the things we're finding is that if young people don't have leadership opportunities, they start leaving the church. And so on the front end, it may look like something like recognizing gifts in people and seeing somebody really organized and say, hey, would you organize some snacks, or would you organize some games that we could do at the rest stop, or whatever. You might lift up and offer small, quote, leadership roles of young people along the way. And then maybe on the way home, as you're thinking about bringing this information back to a congregation or community, you may look and see specifically where young people are moved or what things have caught their imagination, and help them wonder how that might be shared at home. Or as a group, you might sit and think about, how can we take a learning experience that we had and share it back at home? I find that a lot of what we have engaged at a gathering is really interesting to people in a much larger scale, and sometimes how we learned it is as exciting and engaging as what we learned. So how might we be interactive? How might we take some experiences and involve junior high kids, or involve the parents or something like that? So great question.
Wonderful. And Craig is following up saying, how do you encourage leadership with young people, but don't, quote, give away the farm and let them do whatever they want, which might not be where you think it needs to go?
That's great as well. I think a couple things for me have been helpful. I think one is reading the kids and seeing how much they're on board or not. If it's a beginning of leadership, I might give them a smaller task and a little more parameters and say, we have this kind of time, or we need this kind of game. Can you imagine something with that? So kind of little pieces as we go, but also of saying, here's the thing. We need to be focused on discipleship, or what's the purpose of what we would share? And so I find our job as a leader is not only to kind of say what's out of bounds, but also to be pointing, where's the direction that we want to move people? When we share about the gathering, do we just want to share how much fun we had at the water park on the way home or on the way back? Or do we want to really share a provocative thing that we learned about a particular Bible story? Maybe that's more at the heart of what the point of the gathering was about. So for me, it's kind of helping shape that. And sometimes I let kids fail. Now, hopefully that's not putting others at risk, or it's not embarrassing them or embarrassing a group or whatever. But sometimes failure can be a real helpful learning tool in leadership as well. So finding that balance, I think, is helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone, we have time for one more question if you want to get in quickly. While we're waiting for that question, two things. One, if you are watching this webinar with a group of people, we'd love to know how many people are involved. So if you have more than one person at your computer, could you just put that number into the chat box so we know how many people are here? And then also, I want to let you know we have a third Tuesday conversation this coming Tuesday. It's at 1 p.m. Central Time, and it's great. It's Bishop Mark Hansen. So spaces will fill. You can register for that at elcaymnet.org/3TC. elcaymnet.org/3TC. And that's this coming Tuesday at 1 o'clock Central Time, Bishop Mark Hansen. Terri, what could we put into a nutshell? What's the main thing? When it's crazy, the kids are running everywhere, it's midnight, you need to get them in for curfew, what do you remember about being a leader?
Take a deep breath and remember why we're doing what we're doing. This is God's work, God's in the messiness, and God's bigger than we are. And then do something. No, figure out, go on your strengths and say, what are the things that I can do to contribute? And I love that. I'm going to end with, to accompany on the Emmaus journey.
Yay, I love the Emmaus thing. Well, thank you for being here. If you tuned in late, it was Dr. Terri Elton, so thank you, Terri.
It was great to be here.
Thank you. So our next webinar is Sunday, November 20th, and we're moving back to the afternoon. It'll be at 2 o'clock Central, and we'll be with Tiger McLuhan, so that will be great. And our topic is strategic planning. So Terri already referred to that, and that's when you can find out more about that. This webinar has been recorded, and it'll be archived on the ELCA Youth Ministry Network website. Please feel free to download it, use it with other members of your congregation, volunteers, colleagues, whoever needs to hear the messages that you heard today. This and all 7 webinars will be presented as workshops in the ELCA Youth Ministry Network Extravaganza in February. That's in New Orleans, so you'll get a preview of that town. It's an event that, the extravaganza, it's the church's annual gathering for adult leaders in children's and youth ministry. So there are great speakers, workshops, music. This year's theme is Go, and the event focuses on spiritual renewal, great continuing education, and opportunities to network with others who are doing the same kind of ministry. You can see the address there. It's elcaymnet.org/extravaganza. And before I get away from that, that is a resource of an event. Ellen also asked if it's possible to compile a list of the resources we recommend in this series and have it available, and we will. So somewhere on elcaymnet.org you will be able to find those resources. If you're having trouble, please click and email us, and we'll tell you exactly where we put those. Also, each synod in the ELCA has a trained coach who will be offering these training seminars as well as the content from some of these webinars locally in your own synod. You can look on the calendar to find your local training by going to elcaymnet.org/ELCA training overview. So just a reminder, as I said before, our next webinar is Sunday, November 20 at 2 Central with Tiger McLuhan. So please join us for that. Again, my name is Dawn Troutman. If you're wondering who this voice is, you can find out more about me at LutheranLifeCoach.com. And if you're wanting a coach, I'm definitely there, but also really, really support local coaches and people who are around you in your congregation. Thanks for joining us and have a very wonderful rest of your Sunday evening. Goodbye.